Today we're discussing the latest release of RGB, which promises to bring full support for smart contracts on Bitcoin and the Lightning Network. Let's jump in. Welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, and all-around raging capitalist. And I'm excited to do today's video because it has been a little while coming. I last did a video on RGB back in July, I believe, of last year. And with their latest V0.1 update, it felt like a very good time to cover some of the latest and greatest because I continue to think that RGB is one of, if not the most underloved effort in the entire Bitcoin space. And this is what happens when you have no marketing budget, which is sad to say. But today we're going to try and help them out by giving some visibility to what is going on, because it is truly insane the number of pieces that are coming together. So for today, we're going to provide a brief refresher on RGB. Then we're going to talk through the V0.1 update, talk about what's on the roadmap, what's to come, how you can start playing around with some of this. So you're not going to want to miss a thing. For those returning to the channel, welcome back, my friends. As always, it is a pleasure to have you. And for those new to the channel, I welcome you as well. If you like this type of content, I invite you to consider subscribing and join us in our growing merry gang in cyberspace. We are imminently close to 5,000 subscribers on the channel, which is just super exciting. I cover all manner of Bitcoin-related content, including a whole slew of tutorials on how to acquire it, secure it, privacy best practices, running your own node, the Lightning Network, and emerging additional technology such as today's video. With all that out of the way, let's provide a recap and refresher of what RGB is, how did we get here, and we'll go from there. All right, so even before that, let's talk about the motivation behind this. Why is RGB useful? Well, what is the problem RGB is even trying to solve? And the main problem is this idea that blockchains just are not scalable. And so if you want to do all these additional use cases like smart contracts, decentralized finance, you need to build in a lot more complexity, which raises the cost of individual participants on the network. So the cost of running your node goes up. And furthermore, it introduces additional attack surface. Bitcoin script is almost purposefully simple and is importantly not Turing complete, which means that it can't solve any arbitrary computational problem, which is why you had things like Ethereum come into being. And so if we think about Bitcoin as this censorship resistant, unconfiscatable, undilutable money, sound money, but for a sophisticated economy, you also need finance to go with it. So all the cries for DeFi or decentralized finance at their core have merit. The problem is that many instantiations of DeFi are in fact charades, or they're dinos, decentralized in name only. And there is a never-ending list of these projects. Chris Black has been making a lot of great posts of examples of this, but it's just time and time and time again. So much so that I think for a lot of Bitcoiners, the mere term DeFi has this sort of disgusting kind of scammy association, which again is very understandable given the many cases and many rug pulls that we've seen out there. But make no mistake, if you can do this in a way that is actually decentralized, that is enormously valuable. Think of things like decentralized exchanges and being able to buy and sell Bitcoin in a decentralized trustless fashion. Yes, there are peer-to-peer marketplaces like BISC, like RoboSats, and these are incredible tools, and I've done tutorials on those tools, and I invite you to check them out. But at scale, you probably also need things like DEXs to support liquidity for a large group of people. You need AMMs, or automated market makers, that support those different markets. How about borrowing and lending in a decentralized, trustless fashion? What about DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations? Again, a term that has become so besmirched with scams and rug pullery that it's almost unusable at this point. But all of these things are valuable and help form a more complete Bitcoin economy. There's also considerations around privacy. How can we make Bitcoin more private than what its base layer affords? And so the central idea of RGB is how can we support those additional use cases in a way that doesn't impact the base level of the Bitcoin protocol? How can we do all this complexity off-chain, right? Because if you and I want to enter into a contract, Why does every single participant on the network need to fully validate what we as participants are doing? That's the sort of core idea. And so as a brief history lesson, back in 2016, RGB was really proposed as this idea to extend what at the time was this colored coins idea. And it was the idea of putting some information in the op return field within a transaction that could help you manage other tokens like NFTs on Bitcoin. That was colored coins. And around that time, you also had Peter Todd proposing this idea of a single use seal and what is called client-side validation. And this is, again, the central concept for RGB. Client-side validation simply means that we're not doing all this complex validation of smart contracts on chain, and we're instead doing that off chain. You then fast forward to 2019, and Maxim Orlovsky starts to take this forward and really develop many of the pieces that would ultimately go to become the RGB protocol. You have the LNP/BP association established in Switzerland to help provide sort of standards that go along with all this stuff. And then in June 2022, you have the beginning of the rollout of the RGB protocols after a bunch of rework. I mean, the amount of work and effort and thought that has gone into this is years in the making. And then that gets us to today, which is what we'll cover with the V0.1. So let's take a step back and actually talk through these different protocols under this LNP/BP banner, of which RGB is one of them. And I think this is helpful and important even if you've watched my prior video on this topic, because it does take, I think, a couple passes to really grok what is happening. So again, the critical idea here is that the blockchain itself is really, really good at enabling distributed consensus about the ordering of events or the ordering of transactions. However, what about all the sort of metadata attached to those events? Why do we need to store all of that on chain? So we can use the blockchain for maintaining consensus on the ordering, but in terms of the data associated with those state transitions, the data related to these different smart contracts, all of that can stay off chain in this client-side validation paradigm. And so this is very different than a lot of the layer one smart contract blockchains like Ethereum, where every full node has to run and execute every smart contract. That is how we validate all the things. Obviously, there's a lot of different scaling efforts with L2s and rollups and things like that as well. But RGB makes this fundamental design choice of purposefully moving all of that off chain. So you still get the censorship resistance, the double spend protection, and other security properties of Bitcoin itself for the movement of funds that are part of these contracts. But now you have much more scalable smart contracts since all of that data can reside off chain. And so through this layered approach, right, you're not trying to cram everything onto a single layer. Through this layered approach, you're able to get a lot of the best of all these different worlds. So let's talk about the three main protocols underneath this umbrella. We're going to talk about RGB, Bifrost, and Storm. And I'm taking a lot of this from Dr. Orlovsky's presentation from Bitcoin Amsterdam late last year, which I will link in the description. I'd invite you to take a look at that so you can hear some of this in his own words. But first we've got RGB. So this is the smart contract portion of all of this. And so we've talked about off-chain, which means they're scalable. These smart contracts can also interoperate with the Lightning Network, which is a big deal as well. And they are Turing complete, meaning they can solve arbitrary computational problems. Again, the monetary component of a smart contract in the case of RGB is still secured by Bitcoin script and the UTXO or unspent transaction output model that Bitcoin uses. So again, in this way, you're sort of getting the best of both worlds. And you also have some great privacy benefits through things like zero knowledge proofs or zero knowledge bullet proofs, confidential transactions inside the smart contract data. And so critically, this is the programmability layer. And this allows general purpose smart contracts. You could do all sorts of things. You could do, like what we were saying earlier, you could do DAOs, you could do DEXs, AMMs, token issuance, whether it's stable coins on Lightning, collectibles, you could have options, futures, and derivatives contracts, all sorts of stuff. And so importantly, particularly with some of those last examples, you may ask, well, what's the difference between RGB and Taro? Taro being the protocol coming out of Lightning Labs that purports to put assets on Bitcoin as well. And so I'll flash up this comparison. which we should keep in mind is biased from the RGB lens. But I do think it has some good points in it, right? Taro is obviously very recent. It's being backed with an enormous amount of funding, and it does in fact share a lot of the design features of RGB in terms of having some of this client-side validation. And so without going into some of these points around copycat and this and that, it is worth noting that RGB is a much more expansive system than Taro, which is really focused on tokens on Bitcoin as opposed to general purpose smart contracts. Okay, for a slightly less biased comparison, I would invite you to hit pause and check out this great comparison. This comes from this report from Diamond Hands, which is the largest, I guess, Lightning sort of affinity group in Japan. This is an incredibly helpful presentation. I found this while I was doing the editing to this video. So, I will sprinkle this in if I can, but I'll leave a link for this in the description down below. Again, superbly helpful presentation that puts a lot more kind of visual elements to all of this. So again, shout out to them and check that out in the description down below. And so we'll talk through how that works in just a moment, but let's rattle off the other two protocols that accompany RGB, one of which is Bifrost. And really, this is like an upgraded Lightning that enable smart contracts on Lightning. And in fact, really part of this is proposing a more generalized Lightning network. By default, has support for Taproot and Schnorr. It proposes things like multi-peer channels, which could support things like DAOs, channel factories, and you could start to do some really cool finance or, BiFi, Bitcoin finance, their sort of term for DeFi, since the term DeFi is so ruined, without some of the potential routing congestion problems on the Lightning network. So very cool stuff there. And then the final piece is what they call Storm. And so Storm brings the data network and data propagation protocol that provides global state for the smart contracts. Now, I'm not totally clear on how that works regarding global state, since part of the point here is that the contract data is stored only with the contract participants. But I suppose what Storm is doing here is it's basically like a torrent that has a search engine effectively. And so again, I need to do some further research as well, but this is perhaps yet another example of getting the best of all the worlds, because you'd need global state for smart contracts to do use cases like automated market makers, but I'm assuming that this can be like selective based on the contract, is what I'm assuming, right? I'm assuming, contracts can be private or public, and therefore if they're public, they can be kind of searchable in this context. But in any case, what Storm provides is akin to an IPFS, which is like decentralized data storage, and it has embedded payments with sats. So, for those that are familiar with something like Storage or Filecoin, this is effectively similar to that. But again, that's a lot, right? You've got the general purpose smart contracts supported by the RGB protocols. You've got the whole kind of data transport and propagation element, which comes with Storm. And then you've got Bifrost, which basically makes all of this compatible with the Lightning network. Now, you can't have all that extra stuff for nothing. And so what they've also developed are these different nodes. So importantly, you need the RGB node to do any of this stuff. That is what's doing the client-side validation of these smart contracts. And then they've also developed a node for Storm. So you could run a node to participate in the Storm network. And then they've also developed a nice Lightning node, this LNP node, that I believe has the RGB and other components embedded, which would be really nice. Okay. So that's a lot. Let's now talk a little bit more about how RGB specifically works. And so the core concept here is that contracts can be issued or created where the state of that contract, right? There's a genesis state when the contract is created, and then there are different state transitions in terms of participants interacting with this contract. And the state of the contract is assigned to an actual UTXO through this concept of a single use seal. And so this is the mechanism that really binds or connects the off-chain to the on-chain and enables us to inherit some of those security properties of Bitcoin for the monetary component of the contract. So let's talk through an example. And once again, I'm slotting in this great visual from the Diamond Hands presentation, which is way better than the one I was using otherwise. But you can see these two layers. You've got the Bitcoin blockchain at the bottom and the RGB state transitions that are happening off chain. This use case is walking through the kind of simple creation of an asset and then moving or transferring those tokens to different users of the network. So let's say that Alice is the contract creator. She issues this new RGB asset and initially assigns that Genesis state to a Bitcoin UTXO that she owns. So all the tokens of this new asset are currently assigned to Alice. She can now send some of those tokens to Bob by spending her UTXO. And so those tokens are now allocated to Alice and Bob. But the beautiful part is like Alice can't really track anything going forward because it's blinded. So Bob, meanwhile, goes and sends his UTXO. He spends his tokens or sends his tokens to Dave. Alice is not even aware of that, and nor is Carol, who Alice is, later interacting with as well. So you can kind of see in this way that like privacy is pretty well protected. And then finally, when we get all the way to the end, Dave is sending his tokens to Ed. Ed is able to do the validation to ensure that Dave actually has the tokens in his ownership that he says he does. And Ed is able to backwards validate those tokens in a way that doesn't violate the privacy of Alice and Bob. All he needs to know is that Dave has the tokens that he says he has. I would invite you, and I will link in the description down below the kind of black paper that they've put out for RGB that goes through a lot of the detail from a more technical standpoint. But if nothing else, the resulting properties of all of this are the following. You inherit the security, the double spending protection, the censorship resistance of Bitcoin itself, but then you're also able to run and validate these complex smart contracts off chain. So with all that as a backdrop, let's now discuss the latest update and talk about what else is on the roadmap. So once again, the LNP BP Association announced the V0.1 version of RGB that has just been released. And I will link this blog post. These are also the points that Maxim Orlovsky included in the Bitcoin Dev mailing list. But excitingly, it brings the pretty much last consensus breaking changes for the consensus layer of these protocols and unlocks the last features required for implementing fully functional smart contracts. So again, you've got global state and RGB contracts, which make these fully expressive smart contracts. You've got improved contract interfaces. You've got additional kind of data related pieces that simplifies how RGB runs, which is good for, lower end or limited memory devices. You've got simplified integration options for developers. So instead of multiple API calls, you've just got single ones, and also a greatly simplified UX. You can even go to the GitHub and see a demo of this. So, the whole RGB stack has been replaced by a single library API and command line tool. You've got the smart contract data and information that can be communicated using either relay servers or even through the Lightning Network itself, again, via the Storm protocol that we were talking about. Ultimately, this could use things like Nostr as well. I suspect we will see that at some point too. And so again, you can now support full-blown Bitcoin finance, options, futures, DEXs, AMMs. You've got confidential transactions to hide the amount of assets within these contracts, which is very helpful for privacy. And then if we look at the further roadmap, you basically have the gradual ossification of the consensus layer. Again, that's very excited. That means you now have a pretty solid foundation for all of this. It looks like there will be a good amount of work being done around standard libraries for wallets. So just deeper and more advanced integration of RGB with different wallet clients, with the Lightning Network. Notably, some of that would require changes to the actual Lightning Network protocol itself, which is being discussed. One of the most exciting pieces here is this idea of composability within Lightning channels. So the ability to add contracts within Lightning channels, to have multi-peer channels, channels within channels. There's a lot of crazy stuff that is on the roadmap here. And then there's going to be a lot around helping developers actually work with all this stuff. There's the contract language, which is a declarative programming language. So in theory, harder to do something wrong versus something like Solidity on the Ethereum side, and more. So again, just a lot here. You may ask, well, how can I start engaging with some of this stuff? And I will say it is still early days. I wanted to do this video because I do think the 0.1 update is extremely noteworthy in terms of the consensus layer. But just keep in mind that it is still very early for all of this. But there is an encouraging ecosystem that is developing. There are a couple different RGB wallets now. So there is My Citadel. This can work for iOS. It can work for desktop. This is pretty cool. I will likely do a tutorial of My Citadel in the hopefully not distant future. But, you know, it enables usage of Bitcoin just as you would normally expect. Also other assets, other RGB assets. They're going to be rolling out like Bitcoin staking type stuff or putting your Bitcoin liquidity to work for you on the Lightning Network. But very, very cool. You know, the interface looks pretty similar to kind of like Electrum. And so I think we'll see more updates for that. There's also Iris Wallet for Android if you're an Android user. And then there's also Bitmask, which is a web browser plugin from Diba, which is a digital asset marketplace for RGB. And so you can actually see like there are, you know, they don't call them, they're careful to avoid calling them NFTs because that term has been so brutally ruined. And so you could get set up on Diba, check out the Bitcoin art that's being traded there. Do be advised that it's currently running on Bitcoin testnet with, I think, their mainnet launch coming soon. So again, illustrating the early days where we are, but nonetheless, like this is working stuff. Like this is stuff you can go and play with. And for developers who might be interested in playing around with some of this stuff, there are an increasing number of dev tools now. It looks like there's an SDK for RGB wallet integration. There's RGB support through the Lightning Dev Kit now, a RGB plugin for Core Lightning. So a lot more to come, no doubt, but those are some of the ways that you can start to play around with this thing. And again, I will likely do some follow-up videos on some of those specific wallets in the future. So again, a pretty remarkable set of protocols that covers a lot. This has clearly been a very low time preference development effort that's been years in the making. Now, what are some of the reasons that maybe this won't catch on? Certainly the marketing element we've alluded to and talked about already. There is the additional requirement for running an RGB node, for example, or running the Storm node. Although again, it does appear that their LNP node has some of that already packaged within it. I joined a Twitter Spaces earlier today where the Bitcoin OpTech folks were hosting and asking different questions, and there were some considerations around the fact that certain contracts could require what's called random access to the blockchain, meaning that in order to validate the contract data, you may actually need to scan the full blockchain, which could get very inefficient. And so Maxim's response to that is true, but it's ultimately up to the contract developer to be clever in the way that they're building the contracts. This is not a sort of requirement or issue with the RGB consensus layer itself. But I think one of the bigger potential obstacles to adoption, and this might be a fairly cynical take, but I think it is the same for any of the different efforts that are seeking to bring these additional use cases to Bitcoin, whether it's side chains, whether it's, you know, things like the Drive chain, or BIP 300. Question is, will people care if there's not this sort of speculative token that, for better or worse, is part of the reason why other layer ones have attracted the users that they have? It's because you have this speculative token. People are hoping that a bunch of people use this system so that the token price goes up and that we can all become rich. And perhaps a slightly less cynical version of that is there the right bootstrapping mechanism to attract developers to this ecosystem. I mean, the proof is in many ways in the pudding. You look at the Ethereum developer community, which is absolutely humongously massive. Part of that at this point is just network effects, but initially at least, how that interest was bootstrapped was very much premised, in part at least, on the speculative value of the Ether token. So will efforts like RGB be able to attract the same level of interest when they've tried to do things on Bitcoin? They've tried to do things the right way. It remains to be seen. With all of that, let's go ahead and conclude today's video. All right, so we covered a lot of ground today. We did a refresher on RGB. We talked about these three main protocols within this LNP BP association, namely RGB for general purpose smart contracts on Bitcoin. You have Bifrost, which enables all of this with the Lightning Network. And then you have Storm for data that gives you global state for these smart contracts. Collectively, this can power all sorts of different use cases. And so again, the big question is, now that this is possible, again, there's still a long way to go in terms of making all of this highly usable, both for developers as well as for the end user. But I'd be curious to hear, what are your thoughts? What are your predictions on the level of reception that RGB will see? Let me know in the comments down below. And we also talked today about some of the different wallets that you can start having a play around with. We talked about DEBA as well as the digital asset marketplace currently doing its beta. There are other tools or apps or things around the RGB ecosystem that you'd like to see covered in future videos. Let me know that as well. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave this here. I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video, which really does help this get to a broader audience. And again, as I've said multiple times, I think this is one of the most remarkably unloved relative to what it promises to bring and is bringing to Bitcoin. And so this is normally the part where I tell you all the ways that you can donate to support the channel. But instead of doing that, I would invite you to donate to LNPBP to help support the continued development of RGB. Again, I think these use cases undoubtedly add value to the total Bitcoin economy, and there's going to be different competing implementations of this. RGB is one, there's side chains, there's all sorts of other ways that are trying to enable these additional use cases. But I think RGB has taken a very interesting and unique set of design trade-offs that is to be commended. And so again, I would encourage you, if you're going to donate any sats, go donate it to them. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave things here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.